A lot of what I do is because I want to be proud of myself as a parent. One time my son said he wanted to be just like me, and I told him that there were better examples out there, and I told him that shouldn't be his goal. That was a terrible thing to say to my son. I also needed to fix that. When my kids were at the age where everything made them cry, I never told them not to cry, but I told them to save their tears for things that mattered. But it's kind of funny that parents want resilient children to become strong, resilient adults with strong opinions and boundaries, but they don't teach them how to enforce them.
I think people will go out of their way to avoid confrontation. They'll literally go down a route in their life where they're doing things against their values in order to fit in.
More often than not, people that are given things on a silver platter don't know how to deal with adversity. Adversity is the biggest teaching tool we have.
We're preventing people from experiencing pressure. If you want to have success in your life, you've got to have high levels of pressure. And those who do experience the most success are those who are able to handle the most pressure. Welcome to the Warrior Academy podcast.
Hi, my name is Shiloh. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm 35. I'm an 11-year Navy veteran, a father of two. I have a 9-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old son. A lot of what I do is because I want to be proud of myself as a parent. One time my son said he wanted to be just like me, and I told him that there were better examples out there, and I told him that shouldn't be his goal. That was 3 years ago, and then I just intentionally decided that that was a terrible thing to say to my son, first of all, and I own that, but I also needed to fix that. So if I truly believe that, it was on me to fix it, because it's not his responsibility to think he has to take care of dad. It's a position that I ended up in as a kid, and I didn't want him to ever feel that weight. So that's why I do what I do. I want people to feel less alone.
Wow. I love that. That's such a raw, authentic introduction. Like a lot of the time when I speak to people, I say, tell us a little about yourself, who you are. They'll give me a job title, or they'll give me, I've worked in this for this long, or I've done this for this long, or this is what I do. I love that you've gone straight into purpose there, right? With a story of a basically a mistake you've made, which led you down a path to then correct that and to become a great dad and to influence other dads. And how I know you is I've seen your content. I was in the Fit for Fatherhood podcast with Rod, and that was really refreshing for me to be on a fatherhood podcast, because for some reason I don't really see very many of them. There aren't very many out there, right. And it seems difficult for guys to talk about masculine problems, or for men to talk about male problems. And so I'm on a bit of a mission to try and highlight that, and to try and encourage men to understand and see the unique challenges they've got. And so some of the podcasts that I've been on have been really, really interesting. Some really thought-provoking topics around what it means to be a man, what it means to be a dad, around masculinity, around male mental health, all these sorts of things, and how they all contribute to where men see themselves in society. So that's something I'm really passionate about, and something I find really interesting. So when I started to see your content, I was like, wow, it resonates, really, really resonates. And yeah, so it's an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you for joining me.
It's an honor and a privilege. I appreciate it. It's just, there's so much of people like Andrew Tate in the media. Some of what he says is really powerful and really meaningful, and it has value, but some of it is just, a real man won't fear his feelings. A real man will acknowledge them. He'll find a way to fight through them. He'll overcome them, or he'll die trying. It'll be his life's purpose. He will try to get better. And he'll do it in front of people so that he can exhibit that behavior and what it looks like. And men aren't afraid of tears. I mean, I remember when my kids were at the age where everything made them cry, I never told them not to cry, but I told them to save their tears for things that mattered. And it was something that always stuck with me. If this isn't going to hurt you, if it's not going to hinder your life, it's not something that you need attention for right now, if it's just a disappointment, I wanted them to learn kind of early how to manage those things on their own a little bit. And it was just kind of a stepping stone into me. I started as a helicopter parent. I was worried about everything. I was an only child. I spent a ton of time alone as a kid. So I was more the anti-fun dad than I was, who I'm trying to become. That's just encouraging them to be willing to take risks and make mistakes, and it's going to be okay. I didn't want them to jump in puddles. I didn't want them to get sick or mess up their clothes. And It's just, I didn't want them to do anything that could hurt them. But it's kind of funny that parents want resilient children to become strong, resilient adults with strong opinions and boundaries, but they don't teach them how to enforce them at 5 or 13 or 16. They teach them how to be agreeable. And it's unintentional most of the time. So many parents that don't make waves. When you go into the house, I know your uncle's not your favorite person, but go give him a hug. Tell him you missed him. Or these small empty promises, these little things that parents teach their kids to do just so that they don't get negative attention, is something that I decided not long ago I don't want any part of. I want
Wow,
I
I
want
love
my
that.
kids to express opinions.
I think that's one of the biggest issues people have these days. I think people will go out of their way to avoid confrontation, right? And they'll literally go down a route in their life where they're doing things against their values in order to fit in, and they'll have unhealthy relationships which they don't really want to have in the first place in order to people please and in order to avoid confrontation and speaking up for themselves. But I think that's really, you touched on a really interesting point there. We
Confrontation is
do,
really difficult, but it's the biggest opportunity for growth. You
yeah,
don't grow if you did everything right and you're gifted and you're smart and you pass all your tests and you're good at sports, you don't learn anything. You learn
no,
something from in the past, from failing the test. You learn something from missing the lift in the gym, because then you can go back and readdress technique. If everything just works. I mean, they did I don't know if they did a real study, but they did at least an article on gifted athletes that went into Navy SEAL training. What they found was the guys who barely passed the PT test, but they had the heart and they wanted to be there and it was their life's purpose and they had been working on it for years and years, they were more likely, more often than not, to make it through than somebody that was a gifted Olympian, a college athlete. There were even professional athletes that went to Navy SEAL training and Green Beret training. When these people who had been given so many things were faced with real adversity and they had to really toughen up and they didn't get things handed to them and they weren't talked through it, they really struggled. There are exceptions. I mean, Pat Tillman was a NFL football player that went and joined the Green or the Army Rangers, and he did fantastic and gave his life for his country. But more often than not, people that are given things on a silver platter don't know how to deal with adversity. And adversity is the biggest teaching tool we have.
I totally agree. I totally agree. And I think that ties in very much with a society that's trying to protect kids and stop kids from feeling uncomfortable. We're preventing people from experiencing pressure. We've got a bad reputation. Well, pressure's got a bad reputation, right? We look at pressure like this big negative thing, but really the way I see it is pressure is directly correlated to our ability to, experience stress and therefore process that and achieve. And so pressure and success are tied together. If you want to have success in your life, you've got to have high levels of pressure. And those who do experience the most success are those who are able to handle the most pressure. When I say success, I mean traditional success. Obviously, we all determine success in different ways, right? But I would also say, when you look at it that way, that doesn't mean we should, give kids loads of pressure. I think that pressure needs to be done in a way that it has to be done in the right way, and you have to teach coping mechanisms at the same time. And so, if you just give kids pressure, they'll probably take it and crumble and never want to repeat again and stay in their comfort zone, and it'll be a disaster. Whereas if you teach them coping mechanisms, breathing techniques, exercises to self-regulate their emotions and all this sort of stuff, how to have perspective, how to be grateful, all these things that then they're able to handle pressure and handle things that are uncomfortable, they're then able to experience much more success. Is that something you've seen with your own kids as well?
It's something I didn't get to practice until recently. I I spent so much time alone that I figured out how to self-soothe, which a lot of it became the obsessive behaviors, some of the OCD stuff, the eating disorder, binge eating. Those were all things that I did so that I could cope on my own. I mean, I spent a abnormal amount of time alone as a child and spent more time with other people than I did with my mom. She just worked a ton. So until the last couple years, I did as much as I could to help my kids avoid stress. I didn't want the negative attention. And even sometimes I didn't want attention from people I didn't know anyway. So if we went into a big place and, the kids wanted to go pet a dog or they wanted to go say hi to a person or they wanted to go see a thing, I would kind of try to guide them away from that. I didn't want to go talk to people I didn't know. But then I realized I had a therapist that said that anxiety isn't always bad. So I had a series of therapists that told me that if you get anxious or if you have a panic attack, go find a safe place, go wait till it gets quiet, wait for it to pass, and then you come back out. And this guy, Lieutenant Thomas, I was extremely fortunate because at a place where I felt really at the end of my rope, he said, just stay and survive. And I said, what does that mean? He was like, stay, whatever is happening, if it's not life threatening, like if it's not actually going to hurt you, stay there, survive, and then see how you feel. Do like an after action report. What happened that caused it? How did I deal with it? How did I feel when people saw me reacting to this thing in this way? And that was something, stress and anxiety are real, but they're not always bad. Sometimes they're a catalyst for positive change. Anxiety can help you prepare for a test. It can help you prepare for a presentation. It can push you to do something creative that you wouldn't normally have done. And then stress is something that you're supposed to experience before important events. Stress isn't always bad. Chronic stress isn't great, but I mean, I think most people that are going to bungee jump for the first time, do a large presentation for the first time, talk to hundreds of people for the first time, they're going to feel some stress, and it may help them perform if they're able to acknowledge it and address it. It's not always bad.
Mm. Yeah, totally agree. I mean, ultimately, you've got de-stress, which can be destructive and give you physical ailments and make you sick and anxious and derail what you're doing. And then you've got eustress, right? Where eustress is like huge positive energy, but it's actually stressful. It's not peace. You feel nervous and excited, and you're doing something which is outside of your comfort zone, but you might be enjoying it. But the reality is it's still a stressor, right? Whereas you got peace is somewhere in the middle. It's this lack of emotion looking around you. It's not a positive or a negative feeling. It's just being at peace with your environment and your surroundings. And I think that a lot of people, they're looking for peace, but they go about it by looking at the kind of the eustress side. But I think I think avoiding stress is one of the big issues that a lot of people face. And without stress, without any energy, there's no movement. And so it's very, very hard to grow as a person without any stress at all. Don't you find that having kids is like a journey of self-discovery? Because a lot of the stuff that you've kind of mentioned to me, it's like you had the opportunity to learn these lessons because you had kids, because they forced you to become the man who could father them. And therefore you wanted to do them justice.
Well, so I grew up in San Diego, California. I grew up in the middle of the city, and I didn't get a license until I joined the Navy because I needed it for the job that I was going to do. I rode a bus or I walked everywhere. I was from this large city. People love to go there and vacation and spend time there. And I probably didn't leave this little 5 mile radius because it was something I was comfortable either riding a bus to or walking to. And a lot of people said that if they didn't know I was from San Diego, they would have thought I was from a small town. And it was interesting growing up fatherless, isolating myself from people, only having a really select handful of friends. Until I had kids, I didn't know how I felt about things until they happened to them. I didn't know how bullying felt until I saw the look on my child's face the first time they came home and said they were bullied. I didn't have to acknowledge that since I went through it because I put it in a compartment that was, too painful to deal with, and I never addressed it. And as things happened to them, so their grandmother one time said, if you avoid everything that you ever did and you don't talk to them about it, then they could make the same mistakes. If you talk to them about it, you can provide lessons learned. If you never address it, what if they did the same thing you did and you feel like you could have provided them some kind of insight before it happened? So I've done that more and more. Like, my son's 11, and it wasn't until recently that I was willing to tell him I dropped out of high school because I was ashamed of it. But he's so intelligent that it's ridiculous that I ever thought that I could sway him to want to leave school. We do math for fun. He likes to read for a couple hours a day. I'm never going to convince him to drop out of school.
Yeah.
And he didn't even understand why I would. So there are just things that I'm realizing that aren't going to make my kids love me less. Like, this is a daily journey. And when I post things, I was even talking to a guy about it at work today. I don't want to be an example. I don't want to be a hero. I don't want to be something that somebody uses as a guiding light. I try to post things from my perspective of my experience that people can use to feel less alone, that people can use to see hope, that people can use to find purpose. Because second, you make yourself available to people as a guide for people to go through life, as soon as you make a mistake, they think, well, what if I make the mistake? Or was all
Yeah.
their advice pointless? Or I mean, so that's why sometimes I post things that don't put me in a positive light. It's only to talk about the difficult things that most people won't talk about. And I'm doing that more and more as a father, because if I avoid it forever, then your kids don't learn how to communicate about difficult things. Like I
Yeah.
want my kids to come to me when they're 35 and say they're going through a life crisis so that I can help them. I don't want them to be afraid to talk to me because I never brought it up to them.
I think that's a very authentic way of going about it, right? I think just sharing what you're experiencing is true transparency. And I don't think kids need to see their parents as superheroes all the time. I think they need to see them as real people. But it's not a case of they're wallowing in their self-pity. They're showing them this is the way to process difficult situations. This is the way to process pressure. This is the way to live as an adult, a healthy adult, right? And that means that, you know, you've got to show your kids the best kids model behavior. So at the end of the day, they're just going to copy what you do. So if something difficult in your life comes in and it completely, you know, derails you and it impacts your happiness and everything, they'll learn how to respond to things in the way you did. But if you have a very positive outlook, you stay courageous and you keep working hard on something and you overcome something, but you share authentically what you're going through, I think that has a massive impact on kids. I think that they're more likely to copy that positive behavior. It was really interesting what you said as well about what your grandma said, right? If you avoid everything, they're likely to make the same mistakes. And there's two things there for me. The first thing is, when it comes to generational trauma, let's say you grew up without a dad and that influenced you in some way, or you had an eating disorder that influenced you in some way, or you were bullied or whatever. When you look at that, if you don't face those demons, as parents, essentially what we do is we say to our kids, I couldn't face them. Here they are for you to deal with, right? And nothing's more terrifying for a parent than your kids having to deal with something traumatic. Like, it's easier as a parent to go through it yourself, I think, than to force it upon your kids. But we don't realize that. We don't have that perspective. That's the first thing I'd say about that. The second thing is, I think there's a legacy piece here, right? So the way I see legacy is, it's not what you leave with kids, it's what you leave in them, right? And so education is the most important legacy we've got as parents. You have this ability to pass on, you know, lessons. And it's I think it's a great quote from Bruce Lee, something along the lines of, you know, to give your kids the lessons that you wish, you know, don't worry about giving your kids things. Focus on giving your kids the lessons that you wish you had learned when you were younger, right? And I love that because it's something that doesn't necessarily cost you any money, but it costs you far more. The price you pay for lessons, you can't put a dollar sign to, right? People focus on leaving their kids with materialistic things, with wealth, and typically after 3 generations, that's gone anyway. But if you leave kids with virtues and values and an education on how to live as a human being and how to raise their own kids, you're literally impacting, you know, generation after generation after generation and giving them a much more happy life, right?
Well, I mean, if I could leave my kids, say, $10 million when I died, or I could leave them fortitude and intrinsic motivation and discipline, I would much rather leave them the attributes, because they can get that money and more if they choose to. It depends on the path they take. But people are so worried about projecting things onto their kids that they don't share mistakes they made, and then they watch them happen and blame themselves. Where I have difficult conversations with my kids, and I just try to, if I can teach a lesson as I'm going through it in a way that isn't more destructive, because I'm still processing whatever trauma is happening, I'm going to. I posted a video not long ago about divorce. It was really, really, I didn't do anything about that to be popular. The topic of the video wasn't necessarily divorce. It was other people thinking that they get to make moral decisions on your behalf.
Right.
And other people thinking that because I experienced this thing in this way, and it could be divorce or loss of a job or some kind of major life change, if they experienced it and it was bad for them, they assume it's bad for you, and they throw all of that trauma and all of that anger and pain that they didn't deal with when it happened to them onto you, and now it's your problem. So the video wasn't so much about divorce. I mean, one guy said, well, now you made it public. You said it's a personal matter. It is a personal matter. The conversation that we had to have with our kids was, we are not everybody else's story. So when we sat down with the kids, we said, we don't hate each other. We're going to get along well. We're going to co-parent well. Neither of us will ever bash each other in your presence. You deserve better than that. We just told him that our future looks slightly different. But people see the same story told the same way over and over and over. And oftentimes divorce ends in hate and bitterness and terrible feelings that are hard to overcome. And if you're lucky, you get to a place when you have grandkids where you can be in the same room together. And that's not going to be our story. But so many other people took what I said and talking about other people's judgment of your moral decision as I was doing the same bad thing that their parents did or their grandparents did or their uncle did. And they just, I mean, it's amazing when people think that they get to tell you what you did is right or wrong when you weren't asking for permission. I did it for the dozens of DMs that I got from, kids that came from a divorced home and they said, I'm so glad my parents made that decision. They ended up in healthy relationships. Everything turned out okay. And then the opposite of, mom ended up in jail and dad ended up on drugs, or they did this or they did that. And I wish they had separated because we were so sad and miserable as kids that we didn't have a positive example of what a relationship looked like. So I'd rather confront difficult things than worry about them later. I mean, I made a video where I put a bunch of weights in a rucksack. You pay the toll now or you pay it later, because everything has a burden. The positive things have a burden. The negative things have a burden. We add weight to the backpack that we carry on a daily basis with every experience we have. So if you don't occasionally stop, pull out the painful thing, think about it, talk about it, address it, regardless of other people's opinions, that bag's just going to get heavier and heavier. And then you won't notice it until your legs buckle and you can't take it anymore. That's when people have breakdowns.
I think that's great advice. The way I see it is, we as a society, we've spoken about overprotection, right? And we as humans want to prevent ourselves from feeling uncomfortability. And I think we've taken that so far now that we've lost touch of what it means to be human. I think to be human means to suffer. And I think that every single decision you make as a human will lead to suffering, right? You want to get in shape, you're going to suffer in the gym. You want to do well in your business, you're going to suffer by putting in long hours and feeling uncomfortable. You want to, whatever it is you want to do, right? If you want to do nothing, not go to the gym, you're going to suffer because you're going to be overweight and have physical ailments and all this sort of stuff, right? Or low energy. So whatever you do leads to suffering to some degree. And we've got this almost idealistic mentality where we feel like we can chase all the positive stuff in life and not have the perfect opposite show up, right? And it's like you want to just have the good stuff and none of the bad stuff. And I think that's once you realize that life is incredible, life is beautiful, life is filled with amazing adventure and experiences, and it's massively positive. And how lucky we are and how grateful you are, yes. But once you realize and accept the fact that your life ultimately is about suffering for something, and it's just about finding something that you care to suffer about, so that while you're doing it, you're like, I call it digging a trench with a smile, right? It's like you're digging a trench, and you realize this is tough work, but you're just enjoying it anyway, whistling away while you're digging a hole. And I think once you realize that life is about suffering, and you're not triggered by the word suffering like most people, then suddenly you feel free. You're not constrained by the typical man-made kind of narrative of life. We should avoid suffering, right? We should avoid needless suffering, but we should seek suffering for the right things. Would you agree with that?
Right. Yeah, that's something that Joe Rogan and a group of his friends talk about every time they get together and they do things like Sober October. Chosen suffering, intentional suffering with something that sounds just out of reach, but is capable, is really important. I mean, David Goggins talks about the cookie jar and his concept of like, I've done this thing, I've done this thing, I've done this thing. He's pretty raw. It's hard for him to say directly, but sometimes he starts to feel pretty worthless. He starts to think maybe I'm the guy that was overweight and out of shape and had to lose 100 pounds to get into buds, or maybe I am the guy that didn't make it through Green Beret training or Delta training or whatever it is that he's telling the story about. So he goes into the cookie jar and says, well, I did this one time and I did this time. It's hard for people to go back and admit that they did a good job. But I think that is something that David and Joe and a handful of other people on social media, like Andrew Huberman, they talk about don't don't try to convince people that you are what you say you are. Just create a stack of undeniable proof.
I
And
love that.
it's well, it's
But
life
but
isn't
the same way,
I,
with kids, right? Rather than telling your kids how to be a good person and how to behave, show them. Actually, be a good person, right? Be authentic, be courageous. They're never going to know what courage is unless you show them you're uncomfortable about something. So, like, if you know, I love that. I love that quote because it really says to me, you know, that it's all in our actions. And ultimately, I think as parents, if you want to be a good parent, just starts with being a good person, just working on yourself. I think if you work on yourself, your kids copy that. And it's like, okay, you're on the right track. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, and it's interesting. People think that time is equal to quality. And I realized a while ago, I mean, I was a distracted dad. It's still something I struggle with it sometimes. But if I have my kids for a weekend or for a week or for a day, I can spend all that time with them and never actually be present. So when my
Yeah.
son get together and we have these conversations that are really powerful in an hour, and we almost leave, mentally tired because we both had to really think about things from a different perspective, that's way more important. And not long ago, my son and I had a discussion about respect, and he asked why I wasn't concerned with my kids liking me. And, we talked about it for a while. And I told him that when I was a kid, my mom would buy me alcohol. I grew up around Hells Angels and gang members and people that made poor decisions. And me dropping out of high school wasn't even a wave. It didn't cause a rift. Nobody noticed. It
Right.
wasn't really an issue. It was accepted, which was kind of sad. My son couldn't fathom the fact. He was like, they just let you do that. And I said, buddy, I stopped participating in the 10th grade. I was socially promoted from middle school. I officially dropped out in 11th grade and I got my GED, which is the only reason I got into the Navy. And then we were talking about the liking versus respecting your parents. And, when I was a kid, my mom would buy me alcohol. I think that it made her comfortable knowing I was doing it at home and she thought it was safe. And, she had her reasons. And I told her at one point, I think I was 17, I said, I think this is happening too much. And I asked her if she would stop buying me alcohol. And she told me then I should stop asking for it. So I was a child that didn't understand boundaries, but knew I needed them. And then was told by the adult, I can't give you that boundary because I don't care. Essentially,
Mm.
you create your own boundary. I mean, that was why I joined the Navy. I needed some kind of structure in my life. I needed to
Yeah.
learn the structure that I was never taught. I had a wonderful family. My grandparents, my uncles, my aunts, they were amazing, but the majority of my time was spent with people who kind of went in and out of the law and prison and made poor decisions, and you know drugs were involved and my friends' kids were taken away, and it was really interesting to go from that during the week to my grandparents or my aunts and uncles on the weekends and go to church and feel that
Yeah.
conflict. And I had a discussion not long ago with my uncle where he asked if I ever felt disconnected as a teenager, and I said, well, you guys didn't do much digging. You never asked if I was okay. You never asked about what was happening during the week. And on the weekends, when I was disconnected and uninterested, and you seemed that you thought I wasn't present, and it was hard for me to pay attention or remember anything, you got mad at me.
Mm.
So I would develop a secret during the week that I had to keep on the weekends. And then on the weekends, when I couldn't share it because I didn't feel comfortable, I was punished. And it's so when my son and I were talking about like versus respect, I need him to respect me so that if he's 40 and going through a midlife crisis and I'm still alive, he's willing to come to me and know that I'm a pillar of strength, not somebody that he's worried about impressing or being impressed by.
Mm.
I don't need him to like me. I need him to know that if he needs $10,000 when he's in college and it needs to happen right now, he knows dad can do it. Or if his car breaks down, I can get him the help or I can fix it for him. Like I need him to know I'm dependable, not his buddy.
Yeah.
You can do both, but I think it's hard to do. And for 9 years, I just wanted to do anything I could to buy them toys and impress them and make them happy and be the fun dad. And now I'm trying to find the balance.
I think that's very much tied to nice guy versus good guy, isn't it?
Yeah,
Tell me your views on what a nice man is and a good man is. What is the difference? If there is a difference, what is the difference?
a nice person is agreeable. So when I looked up the definition after all the controversy from the video, A nice person, or so not nice person, but the word nice is satisfactory or agreeable. A good person is complimentary, helpful, a handful of other things. They're doing things to propel you. So the example I used with somebody that didn't understand the concept was, if you have a flat tire on the side of the freeway, a nice person will display empathy. They'll drive by, they won't say anything, they won't stop. But when you see them at work, they'll say, "Oh, I saw you on the side of the freeway. Did you get help?" And when you say, "Yeah," they'll be say, "Oh, I'm so relieved. I'm so glad you got the help you needed." But they won't stop. A good person will stop. They may even mock you for not knowing how to change a tire on your own, but they'll
Mm.
help you change. They'll help you get where you need to be. They don't care about making you feel good. They just want to make sure you're okay. Nice people want everybody to feel good, but when everybody feels good, nobody feels good. Because if you're a friend to everybody, you're an enemy to yourself. You can't please everyone and be happy. A good person does what they can to make sure that their self-care is intact, but then they also try to take care of others, because you can't help anybody on an airplane if you don't put your mask on first.
Yeah, I completely understand and relate to that. It's interesting then. So why is someone a nice person? Now we've defined it. Why would someone be a nice person, be a people pleaser? What is the purpose? Where does that come from?
I didn't get any attention, so I wanted to create positive attention. I didn't do well with conflict or confrontation. Even though I was bigger than the other kids, I was still bullied because I physically in presence made myself smaller and weak and kind of meek, and I never wanted to make any waves. So then I just became the funny guy, and I wanted to impress people, and I wanted to be entertaining, and I wanted people to like me because I was funny. So they would keep me around because at least they knew I would make sure everybody had a good time. A couple years ago, I just decided I didn't care about that, because if you have to fight to keep somebody in your life that wouldn't do the same for you in the opposition, you don't need them.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to fight to keep people in my life that wouldn't do the same for me. I'll still be funny. I'll still be the same person I was before, but I'm not going to go out of my way to please people that aren't trying to reciprocate that relationship.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think that being a nice person and being a people pleaser is very much linked to security and insecurity. So I think that people who are typically insecure or lack confidence or lack self-worth, they typically want to kind of bandage that up with the warm blanket of appreciation from other people around them, right? Whereas someone who's when you see a people pleaser and their confidence starts growing, they seek less of that. They typically have less of a, I would say a nice person typically has a massive social group, loads of friends around them, friends, right? Not necessarily friends, but acquaintances, but
Right.
very few deep, meaningful relationships. The relationships they develop tend to be quite superficial, and
Right.
that's one of the risks, I think. Whereas a good person probably has some, deep long-term relationships that have been going on for 10, 20 years. And you might not speak to someone for a couple of years, but they could always come back and rely on you. And it's one of those things where they've got a small, tight circle of very loyal people around them. And they don't tolerate superficial relationships in a lot of ways. That's the way I see it.
Well, Joey Diaz, I love comedy. I make a lot of comedy references because comedy got me through life when I didn't think I would make it. I mean,
Yeah.
I got hope and love tattooed on my knuckles because I felt hopeless and I didn't think anybody loved me. So I needed that to be something that I could provide for myself. So Joey Diaz tells this story, and he's talking about real friends versus fake friends. And he said, a lot of people think you need 25 friends. You don't need 25 friends. You need three real friends. That
Mm.
three friends that will do what you want to do without question, things that won't go against you, things that people that won't doubt you. People like three real friends, in his words, can take over a country. Whether or not that's
Is this
true,
the guy from New
but
York?
what's that?
Is this the guy from New York?
Oh yeah, he's
Yeah,
amazing.
you're
He's one
giving
of
me
the
the PG version. I almost didn't recognize it from what
oh
from
yeah, yeah.
how you kept that so simple. I like it. I appreciate that.
Well,
The
I
actual, if
mean,
anyone wants to see the actual video, then just search for his name and you'll get a pretty raw video on this.
oh yeah,
That did make
yeah.
me laugh. That did make me laugh. The
Oh yeah.
great point though, really, isn't it? Because I mean that's the reality, right? I mean, you're in need, you're suddenly in a desperate situation and you've got 20 superficial relationships around you, no one's coming to your help. You're
Well,
in a situation, you've got three guys or girls who would bend over backwards to do anything to support you. And that's the reality. They're going to be there for you, right?
That's the difficult. So I literally, I only post things so people will feel less alone. I'm not a great social media guy. I don't understand
Mm.
interaction. I don't, I've tried to do trendy stuff. It doesn't really work. It seems superficial. So the video I made with my son, I literally just wanted to talk about a conversation. And, you know, when I made the divorce video, that wasn't something I expected to get a positive interaction. But I was surprised at how many people said, "Thank you for doing this. I feel alone because of blank."
Yeah.
And those are conversations I'll never share, but those are the reasons I do it. And when I made my choice, I thought I had over 20 friends, and I thought I had them from a particular circle. And there's only 2 or 3 people that have said, regardless of whether or not I agree with your decision, I'm here. Everybody
Yeah.
else disappeared. Complete
Yeah.
ghost. They're gone. They said, if you won't make the decision that I'm comfortable with, I will remove myself from your life. And I just let them do it. Why fight to keep somebody in your life that doesn't want to be there unless you'll do what they say? That you're just putting yourself in prison.
And I think this
You're
is
creating.
also where sharing your opinions is quite useful. I've started to share stronger opinions gradually over the last year in particular, and I've noticed some people leaving my life because of them, and other people, coming into my life because of them. And what I realized is that why go through life without being your true authentic self and sharing what you believe in because you're worried about what other people might think or whatever, when actually you're going to end up with a group of people around you who you don't really agree with anything, right? And so for me, there's being agreeable, and there's you can go too far where you're just really difficult to be around. We've all got that one friend who you're worried about inviting over to family dinner or whatever because they're going to say something inappropriate and it's all going to be awkward, and they go out of their way to be argumentative, right? But be the sort of person who has strong values, who commits to what they say and is happy to stand up for what they believe in. And I think that's so important. And I think that's one of the things that we're often missing.
Well, people think that displaying emotion is weak for some reason.
Mm.
And, in the mental health advocate space, I would say that there's two extremes, and it's a spectrum, and there's everything in between. But the loudest voices say, feel your emotions, let them run your life, wait till they pass, it'll be okay. And it's kind of the happy hugs and kisses and comfort and all of that stuff. And then there's, there's the Andrew Tates of the world. They don't exist. Depression and anxiety are only real if you choose to participate in it. If you ignore it, it'll go away. In between are the people, I think, that are like me, or they lean one way or the other, but life is hard. Things happen. You get anxious, you get depressed, but you can move past it if you address it. If you avoid it forever, then it gets harder.
Mm. Mm.
When Mason Sawyer told the story about the cow and the buffalo, if there's a storm coming, the cow runs away from the storm. And every time the storm catches up to the cow gets tired. He has to endure pain. The buffalo runs into the storm, waits for the storm to pass. So he takes a lot of pain initially, and then he's okay. He gets green pastures, he gets grass, he gets all the benefits of not running away from his fears. Whereas
And
the cow
in
gets
either situation, they're all
yeah.
suffering, right? So in either situation, they've both chosen to suffer.
Well, the cow chose to try to avoid to suffer and suffered more. And
But
the
ended up
buffalo said,
suffering, right?
for now. Yeah.
So the decision led to suffering for both of them, basically, and
Right.
that is like sums up life so well, I think.
Well, it's true, but I think the distinction is important to me because if you try to avoid pain, you're just going to feel more pain. They
Yeah,
may have both endured suffering, but the buffalo said, "This is going to be hard. I want it to be hard now." And I worked
precisely.
with people in the military. They made those decisions really well. It can either suck now for a little bit or it can suck real bad later. And some people would say, well, I'll just put it off. It sounds
Yeah,
better to deal with it 3 months from now than it does right now. And then 3 months comes around and you're like, I wish I had addressed it sooner. When if you deal with it now, it's uncomfortable for a little bit. You choose the circumstances, you choose the scenario, you go head on into it and you deal with it. Everything
yeah,
accumulates. I mean, time is a commodity that we give away so freely, and we're not even always giving it away to people. Sometimes we're just giving it away to our mind that's running away, trying to get distracted by social media and people and feelings and drugs or alcohol or whatever your escape is.
yeah,
Time, like the only two things that are guaranteed in life is you're going to die, and you control the way you react to things. You don't control other people, you don't control your situations, you don't control their reactions, you don't control finance, none of that stuff. Anything can happen at any point. So the only thing that you can control is the way you react to things, and you don't know when you're going to die. So if it's tomorrow, why would you postpone pain?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you don't know how much time you have left, so why put something off? It's not guaranteed. I mean, I've lost too many friends to think that, oh, I'll just deal with that later. It's not always, I mean, I miss my friends. Suicide is
Mm.
an unfortunate reality for a lot of people. I wish that I had known that I had said, no, we're going to sit down, we're going to talk about this. But it's not something that, at the time, it wasn't something I was comfortable doing. And last night, I was fortunate enough to talk to somebody on TikTok through all places. And we talked for about 4 hours. His struggle was at 19, he went to combat, he lost some friends, and he said, I'm never going to get that guy back. So I keep going to combat and I keep choosing these tours and I want to go back and I want to save that 19-year-old. I want to bring him home. And he's gone. He's never coming back. But that guy could have died in a car crash. He could have died skydiving. He could have died doing anything. That old version of you is gone. We're supposed to grow. You just have a catalyst to point at and say, that's the reason I feel bad. So
Mm.
you keep going back to try to fix it at the point of origin when just figure out who you are now and try to like that person. Like
Survivor's guilt.
avoiding pain is the most painful thing you can do.
Yeah. 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 It's interesting. I mean, as another analogy, I had a very bad accident base jumping, and I've had to live with arthritis for a long time. It took 2 years to learn to walk again, and one of the things I realized, it took about 8 years for me to be able to walk a lot. And I was always walking under 3,000 steps. Any more than that, and I'd be like, oh, aching so much the next day, until I started to realize that when you've got arthritis, you need to do the thing that you feel pain doing. It's
Right.
like if your joints hurt, you need to move them more. You need to make them hurt more. And it's crazy to think, right? There is a limit, obviously, but I'd suddenly found myself walking 3,000 steps a day, then 4,000, then 5,000, then 10,000. And within 3 months of this shift in mindset, I was walking 40,000 steps a day. And suddenly I was using my legs like I couldn't do it before, right? And so I went from professional fighting to having to do, jiu-jitsu on the ground because I just couldn't do the stand-up kicks anymore. And so the shift there is often the thing that hurts you, the pain you experience, both physically and mentally when you're triggered, actually is just shining a light on something you need to work on. And I think that carries over into so much of life, right?
Right. One, it's interesting because like when I got out of the Navy, I had did degenerative disc disease and arthritis and knee pain, and I had all this pain that I was dealing with. I had worked my way up to 350 pounds, and it got to the point where I couldn't move because I was in pain. And then I had to be sedentary. And then when I was sedentary, I was in pain because I wasn't moving. There had to be a day where I decided
Yeah.
I'm going to intentionally be comfortable for a little while and I'm going to bring back range of motion. And, I would do things like I would use TRX and I would do like 5 squats. And my goal, I didn't want to break a sweat. I didn't want to do anything other than try to get my butt below my knees because I
Yeah.
knew that in countries where they sit in these deep squats and they're able to keep their feet planted squarely and flatly
Mm.
on the ground without any shoes, they have way less of this pain. Like the
Yeah.
pain that people experience in parts of the world that are really developed are from being sedentary. It's from sitting in chairs like the one I'm sitting in right now, an office chair, or it's from doing things in a slightly hunched over position or staring at our phones. And, as soon as I was willing to get uncomfortable for a couple months in a row and I lost 70 pounds, I mean, I didn't think I was ever going to be able to walk a mile again. And then I ran 2 half marathons. And
Amazing.
you're as capable as you believe yourself to be at any given time. So if you think you can't, you won't. But then
Yeah.
people think, okay, if I say that, then if I think I can, I will. And it's not necessarily true. Some people, unfortunately, don't get that reality. But if you think you can, you're buying your lottery ticket and you're trying. And
Yeah.
I'd rather try and fail than not try at all because I was afraid I wouldn't make it.
But there's also the mental side of it, right? So just by trying, you change the person you are. You become a more positive person. And I think that's got a psychosomatic impact on our bodies. We heal better when we're positive.
Right.
It's really fascinating to when you get on that route and you research that sort of stuff. I'd love to talk about male mental health. It's obviously a massive topic, something you're very passionate about. Do you
Right.
think that we look at male and female mental health in the same light? And do you think they are the same, or do you think there's differences?
We, I'm not a professional and I can't speak in a professional way, but I heard Andrew Huberman, and I think Chris Willx, or maybe it was another guest, and they were talking about how women want to feel heard and seen and loved, and they want to feel almost like they're being taken care of. It's an overgeneralization, but they view things differently. Their comfort source is different because men and women both want comfort, but men usually come from feeling valued, from feeling important, from feeling like they're providing. So when you have a man and a woman experiencing depression and you try to treat them in the exact same way, one of them will suffer, or they'll both get haphazard treatment because it's
Yeah.
not direct enough. And it's so personal. Like there are some homes, the home that I was in, I didn't do any of the building of the furniture. I didn't do any of the maintenance. I've never been a guy that worked on cars. Like I'm a mechanic for a living, but that wasn't something that I ever learned how to do until I was 30. So some people take on opposing gender roles, and it just has to do with, kind of agreeableness and who provides the emotional support, who provides the financial support, who provides the support if there's an emergency or a fire. All those things are different. And we try to say that all men are the same and all women are the same, and they're not. They're just not. I mean,
Mm.
Jordan Peterson talks about agreeable men and strong men and stoic men all the time. And he talks about how you should be the pillar of strength at a funeral, and you should, and all these things. And half the time he ends up in tears. So you
Yeah.
can talk about the virtues and the goals, but not everybody's the same. So men's mental health and women's mental health is different in the fact that most men that attempt suicide don't talk about it beforehand, and they do it in a violent way that they can't come back from. Women have more attempts, but that's because they don't do it in a violent manner that seems to be the end all be all. And that created a lot of controversy on a video I made on men's mental health, where the point is it's not who attempts more. The point is that people feel helpless. I don't
Mm.
care that I help men more than women or women more than men. I grew up with a single mom. I grew up around a lot of women. I spent a lot of time with my aunts and my grandma. I have a ton of sympathy for them, but I can't accurately tell their story. I can't tell
Yeah.
it from their perspective. I can't tell their emotion. So it's different, and there needs to be representation on both sides. But men are severely underrepresented because oftentimes they're told, tell us how you feel, but when it makes us uncomfortable, we need you to stop. And that's a
Yeah.
big problem.
Yeah. That's so true. It's one of those things that we ask men to speak about their feelings, but as soon as we do, we there's something that comes up to prevent us from prevent them from continuing. It was interesting as well because that For Fit Fatherhood podcast I did with Rod.
Mhm.
I I posted afterwards saying, "Here's a list of things that we discussed. It was great to be on. Thanks for having me. Here's a list of things that we discussed." And the first few comments were from females saying, um, "You can't say this. We experience the same problems and all this sort of stuff." And just the fact that I was representing men talking about male problems was almost like a trigger for the opposite sex to say you can't do that because it says that we're not feeling those things. When actually, if you flipped it around, the narrative in society is quite typical for a woman to express how they are feeling about a certain problem. You would never have a man commenting on that saying, "You can't say that. We experience that too. It's not just women sort of thing." And so for me, there's kind of this adversarial approach going on between male and females, rather than understanding that we're different. We have this blank canvas approach to gender, and I appreciate that men and women have different levels of masculinity, and you could have a woman who's more masculine than a guy who has more female energy or more feminine energy. But the reality there is that's like 80-20, let's say. And so let's say 80% of guys have higher levels of masculinity than 80% of women, and the 20% of women have higher levels of masculinity than the 20% of men, as an example, right? Pareto's law. And so we often look at it like, let's bend over backwards to be as inclusive as we possibly can. But then we're taking that approach and we're basically saying everyone's the same, rather than saying the majority of people who are male have higher levels of masculinity and therefore are going to experience more challenges like this. And, I look at some of the content that comes out around gender recently, and it's really fascinating. There's something called the man box. I don't know if you've heard of it. It was I saw it online, and it's basically a psychologist who explains a lot of the challenges that men have are through the stigma that men, the kind of stereotypical statements around masculinity. And I think a lot of these concepts are triggering for people, but they actually link very much to male mental health. So one of the first things on this, it's basically a box which has loads of statements on it. One of the first things it says is real men, and it does it like this, right? Speech marks. Real men are physically and emotionally tough. That's one statement. And I looked at these statements. The next one is real men don't show emotions. Real men never ask for help. Real men have control over women. Real men are providers, never caregivers. Real men are emotionally secure. And so I looked at these and I discussed every single line on this with my wife. And I was like, if you take away real men and you just change it to masculine men or men who have embodied their masculinity, and you look at it from a perspective of what do females find attractive, typically in a family unit, right? If you look at men are physically and emotionally tough, typically in a family unit, you need someone with high masculinity to be the kind of the rock in the storm. When something goes on that shakes the foundation emotionally of everyone around them, they need to be able to look at someone for emotional support. That typically lands on the lap of the person who has the highest levels of masculinity. And so you could say real men, i.e. masculinity, highly masculine individuals, are physically and emotionally tough. And the answer there is yes. And so that's just one example of breaking this down. And, you know, the other one is real men are emotionally secure. And then you could look at, well, if you look at the majority of men, you know, we spoke about how they desire, they have got like an innate desire, most men, to provide for the people around them. They want to look after the people around them. People who have high levels of masculinity, we look at females, right? Females with high levels of masculinity actually want to look after people around them, but they're a minority. So when you look at this and we say real men are emotionally secure, well, actually, real high levels of masculinity, individuals with that seek economic security so that they can provide for the people around them because it's an innate drive. And so we've got all these little lines where we're basically saying to young men who we are guiding emotionally and academically and from a psychology point of view, we're saying to young men, you shouldn't be these things. But then they go out into the real world, and the real world wants all these things from them. You know, we're basically saying to young men, you should all be the same. We kind of diminish masculinity in young men, and then we promote masculinity in women. And what we're then doing, and the reason I say we blank canvas gender is because 20 years ago, you'd have all guys would really want to be very masculine, right? And now we've labeled terms as toxic masculinity and all this sort of stuff, which I don't agree with. But you've got this huge driver to be masculine. And for females, it's the opposite, right? And now what we've done in society is to say we're all the same. We're going to diminish what it means to be masculine. And we're going to try and reduce that. We're going to criticize men who are masculine. And at the same time, we're going to criticize women who are feminine. I'm seeing a lot of women out there who they want to be stay-at-home mums. They want to be caregivers. They want their entire role to be very nurturing and look after the kids and look after the husband and look after the home and all this sort of stuff, which is obviously old school, traditional feminine energy, nurturing energy. But that's being heavily criticized. And so what's happening is women are moving into masculine roles. Men are moving into feminine roles more and more. And we're often seeing this kind of equalizer. And it's really interesting to observe. Have you noticed that? And what are your thoughts around that?
So I think that every man or woman, when you're born, you learn the basic set of skills: walk, communicate, crawl. You do all these things. Then you're educated in some way, regardless of what part of the world you're from. Then you're taught a skill, and then you use that skill to provide for your family. Now, where they branch off is a man provides physical, tangible goods, economics, transportation, housing, food. If you have the means, you know, things like barns and boats and, you know, all the above and beyond. And then women provide all of the things for your heart and soul, all of the nurturing goods, all of the things to make sure that you're emotionally okay. They both exist and they're both necessary. Sometimes those are balanced in different ways in particular relationships, but they both want to provide. I don't think there's a dividing line. One wants to provide for you emotionally, and one wants to provide for you in every other way.
Yeah.
And when either of those does that effectively, everybody suffers.
Yeah.
Like men
I mean, this was highlighting purely economic provision. But
Right.
when it comes to providing, I suppose providing emotionally is a nurturing quality, which is a feminine energy, and I think that's something that we as dads need to have as well. We need
Right.
to be able to nurture and look after and protect and show kindness and all this sort of stuff to our kids. One of the things I always say is, you know, the way I speak to my daughter in a really kind and soft and nurturing way is the way that she'll expect her future husband to speak to her, right? The way in which I speak to my wife is the way in which my son will look at the kind of kind, nurturing, soft way I speak to my wife and be like, that's how I need to speak to my wife when I'm older. And so as a dad, you need to be both the yin and the yang. I think that the if you're a highly masculine individual, let's call that yang in this instance, right? You know, you've seen the yin and the yang symbol. It's like black and then a white dot. And I think that, you know, we need to have that white dot of feminine energy within us, the nurturing quality within that masculine energy, if you're the father figure or the masculine figure in the relationship. And but I think that society is kind of bringing that into just one big gray matter, rather than saying we should celebrate the differences, because ultimately, even if you're separated, I had a brilliant interview with Karen, who was she's a single mum in Dubai, obviously runs a great business here as well. And we talked about how even when you are separated, you know, there's still the feminine role and the masculine role. And people often, you know, you can't say that and all this sort of stuff. And that's triggering to a lot of people. And I'm like, well, it's not about gender. It's about energy. It's about yin and yang, right? The feminine masculinity is just energy. But in their situation is the traditional of male, female. And so you know, she has this energy to look after the kids very much from a nurturing point of view, with an element of, you know, empowerment there and very, very, very strict kind of masculine energy. But then the opposing side of that is the dad who comes in now and again, and it tends to be very, very strict. And, you know, the interesting conversation there was the masculine energy is a bit like a judge, and the feminine energy is like a coach. So the coach trains you up for something, gets you ready as your emotional support the whole time, consistently there all the time, helping you with prep. And then often you go out there and you're tested. You know, like the masculine energy, and when you're teaching your kids to swim, is the dad in particular would typically throw the child in the deep end, right?
Yeah.
And I made a joke yesterday on a podcast, and I was like, isn't it funny how, you know, if it was just, I say to my wife all the time, because we're quite traditional with this, and I said to her, if it was just you teaching our kids to swim, they'd still be wearing armbands when they're 40, right? Whereas if it was just me, they probably hate swimming because I go too far. And so, you know, you're in the deep end too long, and they're like, I don't want to do that again. And so it's this perfect balance of empowerment and protection, which creates this almost like high performance zone where kids grow in a very, very healthy way. Have you experienced that? Right. I mean, you're separated, is that right?
Yeah, we're separated. The interest. So I think in the absence of one, a child will try to make up the difference. So when I was little, I was, you know, somewhere between 6 and 8, and my mom had no interest in taking the floaties off of me because she was able to go out and, you know, cell phones weren't a thing back then, but she was distracted with a magazine or a book or something. So she didn't have to pay attention when I was in the pool. Well, I decided I didn't want to be a kid with the floaties anymore. So I took them off and I jumped in the pool, and she didn't know where I was until she realized she couldn't see me out of the pool or in the pool because I was below the water.
Wow.
So I taught myself how to swim by jumping in and then making my way over to the edge of the pool. And I just tried it over and over. I mean, until I joined the Navy, I'd only ever really done the doggy paddle till I joined the Navy, and they showed me what different strokes were.
Wow.
So from 6, 7 to 19, I had no idea what I was doing, but I was not going to be the kid that needed everybody else around them to make sure they didn't drown.
Wow.
And it's it's hard to talk about things like divorce because, you know, the reality is my ex-wife and I know the story and we're comfortable with the story. Somebody always has, you know, hurt feelings. A difficult thing that we've had to talk about recently is if you go through a divorce and there's no abuse or trauma or anything on one side, if it's just a divorce and somebody has one feeling and one person has another set of feelings, it's possible that they're both accurate. So if you check out and, the last couple of years of the marriage, you're just kind of living as roommates. If four people got in a car crash and they all survived and you went and interviewed each one of them, they'd all have a different version of the story, but they're all accurate. So I think people get in their own way because they think, well, if I'm right, they have to be wrong, where that's not true. If you both started getting to a point where you were just doing what you could to cope in an uncomfortable situation, you were right and I was right. One of them doesn't mean the other was wrong. And when I was confronted and said, well, what are you going to do someday when your kids see this and, you got a divorce and they think that's the easy way out? And I said, I don't want to make you uncomfortable and I don't want to fight with you. I want my kids to know that that wasn't the example that I want them to see for how a husband and wife treat each other. And it's difficult. The part of social media is, I'm only telling one side of the story. We were best friends for a long time. I hope again we will be. And, it is what it is, but it's a really difficult thing to attack and comprehend, especially when you're dealing with kids, because my son continuously wanted to know. It's like, I just need to know why. Can you tell me why, Dad? And I said, no, I don't want you to know why, because there's no hate or ill will or discontent. We just got to a place where it wasn't going to work anymore, and I was willing to make the choice. And he said, well, I just need to know so I can sleep at night and I can feel better. And I said, I don't want you to know that because you may feel the need to take a side. He said, I
Yeah.
love you both. Don't take a side. And, he's an amazing kid with a big heart. And kindergartners, he used to read to him and walk him to the bus. And I said, it's born into us. A girl is more likely to side with her father if there's no abuse, if there's nothing bad that happened. Girl's more likely to side with her father, and a boy's more likely to side with his mother. He said, I don't think that's true. And I said, okay, if one of your kindergartners or two of your kindergartners were walking side by side to the bus and a boy fell and a girl fell, same time, right next to each other, who would you help first? And he said, I don't like that question. And I said, why? And he said, because I'd go help the girl, assuming the boy would be okay. So
Mm.
they're just blanket statements and these roles that people think you have to fill and you have to assume. I've found over the last year that I have a really unique ability to make people feel comfortable regardless of race, age, gender, ethnicity, region from the world that they're in. I've held a guy as he cried telling me his story of abuse, and I've held a girl cry as she was telling her story of abuse. I've done it at work, I've done it at the mall, I've done it in all these random places. And people just need to take off their lens when they're getting information and view it for what it is, not for what happened to them.
Mm.
That's the painful thing, is everything you hear through the lens of all your life experience, all your good and your bad, all the things that you've heard. And when you hear a triggering word like depression or anxiety or divorce, you associate it with all the things you know it to be, when that's not everybody's story.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's brilliant advice. It's fascinating, really. And the boys signing with their mothers and the girls signing with their fathers. I think that is a typical thing. It'd be interesting to see the studies on that as well.
One, as I was going through and making the choice, and it was the most difficult choice I ever made in my life.
Yeah.
People said, you're quitting, and it's not quitting to choose you. Whoever's listening to this, guy or girl, it's not quitting to choose to take care of yourself. What happened was, over the course of 15 years, when I became, a disabled vet and all the things that happened to medically separate me, I was not the same man that I was at the beginning of the relationship. When we started talking about things that changed, things that we both needed, things that needed to happen, they just eventually didn't happen. And I think
Yeah.
some people will stay because it's more comfortable to stay in the uncomfortable known than it is to make a change that could be good for everybody. When
Yeah.
I I legitimately believe that I made the right choice, and I think that we'll both be happier someday. But people can't accept that. It's
Yeah.
not, divorce is bad. You don't do that. Whether it's religious or not religious, or it's from a painful experience they had, people think that they get to tell other people how to live their lives. And when you're brave enough or bold enough to stand up and say, this is the choice I made, and I don't really care if you like it, there's a lot of angry people.
I think that mentality, kind of philosophy to decision making, influences everything in life, right? It's the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. And I love what you said about the, people are more happy to be in the uncomfortable known than the uncomfortable unknown. And like I mentioned, like I keep mentioning, both lead to suffering in some degree.
Right.
Shiloh, what would you, just to wrap up now, what advice would you give if you had to kind of give 3 pieces of advice to dads? Maybe practical or maybe mindset. Just 3 pieces of advice. I know it's difficult to summarize all your kind of thoughts and research and what you believe in, but if you had to give 3 practical tips to dads who are listening to this, what would you give?
So if you were a dad that grew up with a dad and there were things that you wished you had gotten, don't die knowing that you didn't give those things to your son or your daughter. And then if you were a dad that grew up without a father and you're teaching yourself for all these things for the first time, learn from your mistakes. Acknowledge when you did something wrong. Don't stick to it because it's familiar. Learn and go forward and be willing to tell your kids when you made a mistake. For a long time, I didn't tell my kids that I was bipolar. I thought it was foreign. It didn't make sense. I thought they would think it was confusing and they would walk on eggshells. When they were relieved, okay, I understand now. Sometimes dad comes in and he's in this energy, or he hears a loud noise and it freaks him out and something changes. So that made everything better compared to me hiding it for 8 years and then wondering why on the flip of a dime dad could lose it. So do the things that you wish somebody had done for you. Do the things that you saw done wrong that you want to correct for the next generation so you're not passing down trauma. Don't be afraid to feel your feelings in front of your kids. There's so many men that don't know how to cry because they never saw a man in their family shed a tear. And I ran across something called the Amend Movement on Instagram not long ago. The first video I saw was these big, powerful, covered in tattoos, very muscular, these big masculine men holding each other and crying and embracing. And if it would be possible to build a community like that everywhere so that if it's available, if you need it or if you want it, I want to start a community center here for veterans, first responders, and troubled youth because you can build community around suffering if it's intentional and it serves a purpose. And when you put yourself in that shared suffering space, you have something to bond over, and then you're able to acknowledge things that you went through that you couldn't talk about otherwise. So, I mean, the Amend Movement is a really powerful thing, and I'm looking forward to talking to their team more and seeing things that they do because real men feel their feelings and they're not afraid to cry. A tear doesn't scare a man.
No, and I think all those pieces of advice are so valuable. I think commenting on that last one, a lot of men approach stoicism as a way to kind of live as a man, to have a stoic philosophy on life. And stoicism was never meant to be, it's criticized a lot for people not showing emotions, but it's not showing emotions, right? It's understanding and observing the full capacity of emotions, both the positive and the negative, and embracing them, but not letting the emotions overrule you, being in control of those emotions. And when a man isn't in control of his emotions, I do think he's very dangerous. Right? If you ever see a guy like stub his toe on a sofa, he doesn't immediately burst into tears, right? He gets angry. If a guy is hammering away at something and doing some DIY and hits the hammer on his thumb, he's immediately crossed. It's not overwhelming sadness or tears that would be his reaction. And so I look at when people say men should show their emotions. Yes, they should, but they shouldn't be reactive. I think men should proactively try to understand their emotions and process their emotions, because what we repress, we then express in other ways, whether that's passing on insecurities to kids, or whether that's, harboring unhealthy views about ourselves or whatever it is. And I think, or even psychosomatic diseases that we can create from holding on to stress and trauma. But I certainly think that's very different to immediately reacting and expressing emotion. And I think men in particular need to be very careful with how they show emotions, because the repercussions of them being reactive can be so devastating.
That's the hard part. So men, you should feel things and you shouldn't be afraid to cry. It will be used against you if you do it in front of the wrong people. If you're working in an industrial shop and the wrong person sees it, everybody will find out, and then you're the weak guy. And
Yeah.
it's not that there's anything wrong with showing emotion in that situation. It's if you want to deal with the repercussions, because you can't control how they react to it. You just control how you react.
Yeah.
So I don't think anybody should get on the internet and talk about their emotions as much as I do, as frequently as I do, or as open as I do. I think
Mm.
it's reckless for some people. And sometimes I have to take a step back and evaluate what I talked about and why.
Yeah.
Is the wound still too open for me to address it? Was that smart? Because you just need a circle of trust. You, if you're dating somebody and you've just got together, maybe you don't spill your guts. Maybe you wait until there's an established connection and you know that there's support that goes back and forth. Maybe when you meet your buddy at the bar, maybe that's not where you spill your guts, because it's not going to be a constructive conversation while you're intoxicated. But you should have a circle of trust. You should have a confidant. You should have somebody that you can go to if you need help with something or if you need advice. And that person, it should be reciprocated. You shouldn't talk to somebody about all your issues that isn't willing to do the same with you. But
Yeah.
what I do, not it is not a smart way to pursue fixing your mental health. But like simple things
It
like,
can be dangerous because you can then attract a lot of negative energy when you're also trying to process something, right?
yeah. And little things like when I was little, I always wore a t-shirt in the pool because I was always the chubby kid. Well, then when I noticed my son wearing a t-shirt in the pool because I was the chubby adult and I was the chubby dad and I didn't want people to see me, I started taking my shirt off just so that he would take his off, but he had
Yeah.
established the behavior and the pattern. And then we had to have a conversation about why. So
Yeah.
like
And if you don't,
if I had
if you don't address it yourself, your kids will do it. You'll have to address it with your kids, right?
well, and
Wow.
that's the thing, if you hand something down to your kids, but you don't explain to them why you want them to stop the behavior, they won't get it. He didn't know that I did it because I was self-conscious, but he didn't need to be self-conscious because he had no reason to be. So until I explained it, he just thought, well, dad's a jerk. He's weird every time I wear a shirt in the pool, but he does it, so I did it. Those conversations you have to have with your kids that may make you
Wow.
uncomfortable to
I think
have.
that's such a powerful example of modeling behavior and modeling insecurities or lack of confidence or whatever it is, right? And then it's just the fact that you then have to teach your child, no, you don't need to behave that way. That's just the way dad behaves because dad's been through this. And then you go through the phases like, why does dad behave that way?
Yeah.
And this is what I say to people, kids are the best teachers, right? It's like I've one of our instructors recently they got the news that his wife, his wife is pregnant. And I said to him, when the student is ready, the master will appear.
Yeah.
And I'm like, the real black belt journey is about to begin.
Well, you have a son and a daughter, or two boys, or two
Son
girls?
son and a daughter, yeah.
Which one is older?
My daughter's 6 and my son's 3.
So what I've found, and I don't know if it's because I grew up without a dad, it's never been hard for me to parent my daughter because I don't know, it just comes naturally. I feel like I need to take care of her. I don't feel like I've made incredibly questionable decisions. I want to make sure she's safe. I want to make sure she feels loved. I want to make sure she feels secure. But when my son and I interact, there are times where I have to step back and wonder if I'm being too hard on him because I wish
Mm.
somebody had taught me those lessons. So I'm trying to overcompensate and make sure he knows. So there have been many conversations my son and I have had over the last 2 years explaining, no, dad doesn't hate you at all. It's not possible for dad to hate you. You're so much like me that I fear that you will go through the things that I went through if we
Yeah.
don't have these uncomfortable talks.
I think that often when you're raising a boy, when you're raising a girl, that first of all, when you're raising a girl, you look at it a bit like subconsciously you're protecting your wife because they remind you of your wife in so many ways, right? First of all, that they created them, and second of all, that there'll be little mannerisms that remind you of them. They look like them, maybe, or whatever it is, and so a part of you is like you have this very protective energy
Right.
naturally towards them. But I think when you're raising a boy, you've experienced life as a man up until the point that you are a dad, and so you have this ability to understand what it is your son is going to go through, and you understand the challenges that he's going to have to face. And so with that in mind, because you've experienced them as a man yourself, and so with that in mind, you then are particularly strict or particularly what's the word, you have such a drive for building resilience in them so that they can actually stand up to a lot of the challenges that you've been through. Do you know what I mean? And so then you start to link that back to your own history with your own dad and the way that he raised you and the things that you wish you had learned or didn't learn, or, you know, the way in which you were raised. You start to question, well, okay, was that the correct way of doing things? Do I want my son to have the same relationship with me as I have with my dad? And if not, then why? If you do, then how? And so I think that's a really interesting point of view. You know, I think as dads, you do naturally raise your son and your daughter differently with some things, right?
Yeah. And it wasn't even something I noticed until one day Logan asked why I was too hard on him. And I said, you're so much like me that I would like it if you could avoid at least some of the pain that I experienced. I mean, it's hard to be when masculinity is really popular and it's really cool. I could never effectively practice stoicism, because stoicism isn't the absence of emotions. It's not publicly acknowledging them and giving other people the gratification of seeing the reaction. You still feel them, still experience them, but you control the world's view of you because they're not seeing them get anything out of you, positive or negative.
Yeah.
They're not going to rise out of you and make you laugh because you're stoic, and they're not going to make you sad because you're stoic, but you're still going to go home and have the thoughts and the feelings. But that's not something my son and I could effectively practice when we have, I mean, we're built out of empathy and compassion. We lose sleep over our friends not having enough money for gas. We lose sleep over our friends being sick. Like I worry a lot about people. That's the only reason I bother reading comments. I mean, they may be negative, but occasionally there's been somebody that needed to make a phone call because they felt like it was their last night on earth and they needed to talk to somebody. And
wow,
they're still here. So stoicism might be really cool if it's effective for you, but if you try it, don't force it. People need to be who they are.
Brilliant advice. Shiloh, really, really insightful, authentic conversation. Really enjoyed it. It's always been an hour and a half. We could carry this on for another hour, I'm sure. Just hearing your thoughts on some really important topics around being a dad, masculinity, marriage, raising kids, mental health. So yeah, really, really appreciate you coming on. Thank you, mate.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for having me.
I really hope you enjoyed today's Warrior Academy podcast episode. We're going to keep creating these episodes because I know that so many parents find them useful or get insights or get ideas about how to develop their child's character. But it all comes down to the 3 C's: confidence, conduct, and concentration. So if you want to get a deep insight into the levels of confidence your child has, the level of concentration they have, or the level of conduct they have, so that you can actually put a score next to it and then work towards increasing those scores like we do in the Warrior Academy, then I'd love to invite you to fill in the Breakthrough Area Assessment. It takes about 5 minutes of your time, and you will get a personalized PDF report on your child's 3 C's. To access the Breakthrough Area Assessment and find out your child's 3 C's score, all you need to do is go to www.breakthrougharea.com.